Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
While you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word, you embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Welcome to the show. I'm Eric.
And I am Aisla.
And this week we were going to look at something that's making the news. If you do follow any news at all, you've probably seen stories locally and nationally about this. But it seems that it has already begun.
We're ready for a new temperance movement.
Yes. And we'll just cut to the chase. We're talking about the abortion laws that are all being escalated around the country, specifically at the local level. And it's being done by groups and organizations that are expecting this, at least some of these, if not all of them, to end up in the Supreme Court now that they've shifted the justices around a little bit to challenge Roe v. Wade.
So I have a little bit just to summarize the history of Roe versus Wade, the legal case that decided the current lack of restrictions was decided in 1973. And it was based on a woman's constitutional right to privacy, which is also the same right that was used to allow same-sex marriage, in terms of recognizing that a person's right to privacy is what allows them to make some of these personal decisions.
And it's been long enough. I'm actually curious how many people even remember that was the case. Like what the real, everybody knows Roe v. Wade was what granted basically a constitutional protection to be able to have an abortion, but not why.
And one of the things that was written, one of the justices, part of their opinion, they said that, and I find this to be interesting, compelling state interest is what justifies regulating or regulations limiting fundamental rights,
Right.
such as privacy, and says legislators must draw statutes narrowly to express only legitimate state interests at stake, right? So
Yeah.
in that case, and that's once again how they got to same-sex marriage, that they couldn't justify a legitimate state interest in the gender of the people who were making the commitment.
Yeah.
Similarly, there was a lack of genuine or justifiable state interest in heavy regulations on abortion, because even though this made it legal, or to a certain extent, what it actually did was it removed a lot of restrictions. You could get legal abortions prior to Roe v. Wade in doctors' offices for a very narrow scope of circumstances that were often based also on the doctors. So the doctor was the one who had the right to make the decision rather than the person who was going to have to carry the child.
Right.
Much like what you were talking about earlier with the folks that you know that were women that wanted to get tubal ligation, and they were not, and this is a modern situation, they were denied that by their doctor.
And to explain that in more detail, it was the offline conversation before we started recording the show today about friends of ours that we have that were told by doctors, no, you cannot have your tubes tied or any kind of permanent kind of contraception practiced on you on the basis that you don't have kids yet, or we've heard stories about people who needed their husband's approval, or all sorts of reasons. But essentially, it was the doctor saying, "I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to recommend it be done. I'm not going to give you a referral to have it done because you haven't met what are, in my opinion, my requirements." That's the doctor. to make that choice.
All right. And one of my personal curiosities around this conversation that we have in our country around this issue, as it continues to be such a hot button issue, is when we look at our legislative practices and our public discourse, there's a lot of, strongly opinionated and outspoken anti-abortion people, and yet those same people don't seem to have a fervor for uh, like early childhood education or advancing the movement for adoption as an option, um, or even interestingly, like free and easy access to birth control. So it to me, there's this curiosity of if your genuine commitment is to fewer abortions, then wouldn't or perhaps your commitment is to the quality of life for children, either one of those, to me that would come hand in hand with, a family leave act that allowed, mothers and fathers to stay home after a child were born, and would also have, more public childcare options or support for families with children with disabilities. Like children with disability, families who have children with disabilities end up often having heavy burdens, and there isn't necessarily a lot of assistance for them, either in community or provided by the state. And yet, I don't feel like I see that level of activity, that fervor. We don't, we don't have any state Supreme Court things around that. And yet, as you pointed out once again in our conversation before the show, there was this level of tolerance for some of Trump's more egregious behaviors because people were like, well, we need a conservative president so that we can overturn Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Like,
I saw interviews, with people who were saying that Trump was problematic, but they were going to tolerate it because they knew during his term, even if it was only one term, they could likely get the justices that they wanted to have seated.
and so for me, that is definitely a point of curiosity and definitely confusion in that these different behaviors don't match with the values that I would personally expect to see in somebody who was calling themselves pro-life.
Yeah.
Because I would think pro-life would be a broader perspective than one particular action around children.
Exactly. Well, it turns out that it's pro-life, not pro-family values, not pro what that life should look like, not pro, options. It's just this this argument based on the Bible about it's a life, therefore it's murder and it needs to be protected. And the ironic thing about it is that's usually the same group that's in favor of the death penalty. So, I mean, my whole issue with abortion arguments in general are that they tend to come from very odd places. I mean, you could even make the argument that the right tends to be the party of, traditional family values. So I get that. And they also tend to be the party most likely to argue towards personal freedoms, right? Unless that personal freedom is pro-choice, or unless that personal freedom is gay marriage, or unless that personal freedom is not in line with their religious views of what personal freedoms should be.
Yeah, it's a really interesting puzzle to look at, and it's one of those that for my background, I was obviously, as we've talked about before, very conservative religiously and politically, and I know that my own process of this understanding this issue was actually very much one of starting from a place of religious conservatism, and therefore in my case also political conservatism, and being anti-abortion. However, For me, I wasn't necessarily anti-abortion being legal in that I've always been pro-choice in a more profound sense than just the one issue. I feel like it's fairly evil to determine for other people how their life should go. And I'm also very pro-child, and I feel pretty strongly that if somebody is confident that they don't want to have a child, so much so that they feel an abortion is their best option, I'm not sure I feel like that child is going to get the kind of care and life that we want children to have.
Well, and that right there is, I think, why this is such a bizarre argument, because everyone I've talked to comes at it from completely different places, right? I mean, for some people, it's strictly a women's rights issue. For some people, it's a quality of life for a child issue. For some people, it's a religious issue that they think somewhere in the Bible it says abortions are bad. For other people, it's a, rule of law ethics, it's murder. You know, there's so many different things. And the thing about it is, that's why it's such a muddled argument. I mean, even Roe v. Wade, like we brought up at the beginning of the show, was based on the just a basic concept of privacy,
Mhm.
not even any of the other things that different states have tried to pass into law about what counts as a life, is there a heartbeat, or anything like that. It was literally down to you're infringing on somebody's privacy.
Yeah, and part of why, I was talking about the temperance movement, and in terms of looking at this, there's definitely a parallel that I see to the prohibition of 100 years ago, when alcohol was in a similar fashion made illegal by a very small, determined, vocal group of activists, and I mean they were amazingly successful. Hats off, and and it led to a situation in our country that was, in some ways, I don't know that we've ever really recovered from it, where ordinary citizens became criminals because people were used to having their glass of wine or their beer or whatever, and suddenly they couldn't have it, and they didn't really see anything wrong with it. And so the majority of people became comfortable with being disdainful of the law. And one of the things that makes a republic function efficiently is that the majority of people are invested in upholding the rule of law. And we kind of hit a cultural situation where that wasn't true. And I'm curious as to how much of what we're dealing with today is the result of having had that occur, right? Having so many people feel a sense of
Well, and that actually leads right into my next point perfectly,
oh,
because
you're welcome.
what I find most interesting about this one is, unlike Prohibition, which was a federal law banning alcohol, and different places handled it in different ways, and you had rum runners and all of that sort of thing. What's going to happen here is it's going to further divide the country, because you're going to have states where it is legal and protected, and you're going to have states where it is illegal and completely frowned upon. And you're going to have people going to the states to have abortions on the short term. And in the long term, people are going to start seeing things like that and realizing that the state that they want to live in, that reflects their values, is going to become more and more of an important thing.
No, I do think we are becoming more sort of regionalized. What was interesting to me was reading through some of the articles, and I don't want to give numbers because it is changing so much. However, like what you're talking about is already occurring. Some states, mostly southern states, are passing what they're calling trigger laws, which are laws that are currently not enforceable because of the federal decision around abortion, that would then, if Roe v. Wade were overturned, immediately become
Yeah.
enforceable. And there are a few states that are passing protective laws, one of which was Virginia, which I found to be interesting. So I think that would surprise people.
So explain the protective law.
So they're passing laws that would guarantee a woman's access. They're making a state law to kind of duplicate the federal law around access to abortion for women in their state,
Yeah.
and removing some restrictions and
So
regulations.
kind of the opposite of the
The trigger law.
of the trigger laws, or
Mhm.
any states that have basically tried to push
Right.
Texas has tried 9 times at last count,
Yeah.
possibly more, to pass laws that most of them ended up getting shot down because they were up against this. But one of the key things to remember here is this is not any kind of a constitutionally guaranteed thing.
Right.
And
It
what
can be
we're
overturned.
Right. This Once those justices decide to overturn it, then the precedent is reversed, and no judge in a lower court's going to go against that precedent. That's what it really is. That's what legal precedent represents, is if you can predict how the Supreme Court would rule on it, or if it's been ruled on a certain way, there's really no point in fighting it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other situation that has occurred is there are laws that are getting passed, for example, where people who seek abortions or provide them can be prosecuted for criminal activity. So, in some states, so it's being criminalized, and that, of course, makes it riskier. So, even though the abortion itself isn't criminalized, it's the act of performing or seeking. So, it's a weird little distinction. And several states have passed what they're calling heartbeat laws. Currently, the standard that Roe v. Wade has is if the fetus would be viable outside of the body, then it's no longer legal to perform an abortion.
And that's the third trimester thing too, like, unless it's a very rare case. Those are generally in most states frowned upon.
Right. And so but the heartbeat law puts it at 6 weeks.
Right.
Most women don't know they're pregnant, but usually 5 weeks is a good time to know. Like that's being really diligent.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't even remember, like, pregnancy tests need at least 3 or 4 weeks before they're viable.
Yeah, there's
I'm
like,
not an expert on this.
well, I mean, like for me, I had 2 children and they were pretty close together. And I didn't know I was pregnant with my second child until I was 4 months along.
Yeah.
So, you can be pregnant for a while. I mean, I wouldn't have been eligible. I wasn't at the time open to the concept of an abortion. I wouldn't have been eligible anyway because past the first 12 weeks is where a lot of places draw the line. So even though the federal restriction is like 22, 24 weeks,
Yeah.
most clinics, I believe, are at like 12 or 14, and first trimester.
Yeah. Well, so that brings me to another point we were talking about right before we hit the record button today. And that is the idea that on both sides of the aisle, the general agreement is less abortions would probably be good.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
and there and that's another place where, again, our inability to preemptively deal as a culture and a society with a lot of this is what kind of causes the issue. We are a prudish um, country in general. And so, we have all of these different things, what can be taught in sex ed and all of that sort of thing, that seems to be a difficult conversation for people to want to have, except that if we weren't prudish about contraception, if we weren't prudish about teaching people about the potential, risks of various different things, um, you know, education and all of that, could lead to some smarter choices on that. And then we also get into the realm of what happens if, somebody is raped. And it's like we have such a prudish view of that we don't even want to deal with the fact that, like, why should a mother have to raise a child that not only did they not want, but was a product of violence?
yeah, eh, there's a lot of like emotionally triggering, very deep religious, philosophical, moral questions around the these different topics that you're bringing up, and in a lot of ways they feel like red herrings to me, in that ultimately, in terms of how we approach this from a societal perspective, it's become this kind of weird flashpoint. And when we if we were to say, so for what you were talking about earlier, so for example, like the Republicans tend to be pro personal freedom and pro gun, pro death penalty,
Pro family values.
pro family values, and yet more typically, right, because that's what the desire for Trump was, the one of the things around the election, they're also anti-abortion. And so to me, it seems like the conversations that we have, they're moral, they're philosophical, religious, they're highly triggering, they're highly emotional. I don't actually think we're having the conversation we need to have as a community and a culture. I think we're having like maybe like a big emotional argument. and and honestly, people are in a habit of just reacting, right? Like, somebody says abortion and you immediately know where you stand, what your, 5 points are, and who you judge around it, whether it's the liberal or the conservative. Or and I know for me, I read a bunch of articles, and as I said, I came through this process of starting from a place of being very conservative and also very anti-abortion. And some of it was because I love kids so much.
Yeah.
I was just like, I've always loved kids. And so I couldn't really connect to like not loving kids. And what's interesting to me is, as an adult, so many of my female friends are actually childless by choice.
Yeah.
And so it's just and they're like, and it's not even that they don't like kids per se. Most of them are just really clear, like, that's not a responsibility I want to take on. And yet they are some of the best with kids that I know. Like, most kids love them because they
Yeah.
treat kids like people rather than this, I don't know, burden or assumption that a lot of folks have. So there was that for me. And then I was reading these articles about women who'd chosen to have abortions because I was curious, like, what is it that motivates someone to do this thing that I feel is so, like, painful? Like, I just couldn't even imagine, right? And the stories were so heartbreaking. And it wasn't the violent ones. I mean, those were hard, of course, to read. But it was the woman who was like, you know, I had 9 kids and I couldn't take care of another kid. And I felt like I was already neglecting 6 of my kids. I didn't feel like I was being a responsible parent. I didn't feel like I was executing my duties. She was a religious person, right? As a mother, for my God-given kids. And I was like, oh, there's this rhetoric we have around it that becomes this national dialogue that you're talking about. But the stories, every person's story that I've ever heard is, it's actually a lot more conscientious and responsible, and it actually often is very child focused.
Yeah.
Or it's very thoughtful in terms of, I'm 18 and I want to go to college and I don't want to be dependent on the state. Also a value we have from the conservative community, right? And I'm not sure I'd be able to pay my bills and actually take care of myself if I did this. I don't want to be on welfare. Like, so many of the reasons that are given are these very practical and community values reasons. Not just these the moral emotional stuff is the rhetoric that we have in the political ideological world. The actual things that people say are typically a lot more grounded and practical. And we don't have those conversations in a political way, as far as I'm aware.
No. Well, that's also the reality of our current political environment. The
Fair.
the subject matter is an entity in and of itself. It's not personalized in any way, right? It's protect the unborn life, regardless of situation, or it's a woman's right to choose, regardless of the situation.
Yeah.
Don't you dare humanize it. How dare you?
Sorry, I don't know what I was thinking.
But that's the thing. I think that's another aspect to this too, is it's so case by case. There's so many different situations. And yeah, I was referencing certain things because um even I bought into this rhetoric. I'm not a woman. I will never actually make the choice myself. So I can be pro choice, but it's the same way that I'm pro women's rights. It's my connection to it. Um for
Well, I
somebody
mean,
else it's a
because
personal experience.
yeah, exactly.
And in that way, I think personal freedoms in that way are actually good because you should be able to direct your life the way you want it to go. And there are options. And in fact, they get used against people. We were looking up articles, and we can post some about the fake women's health clinics. And they're not fake in that they don't exist. They're fake in that the information uh, that they offer, they're often created and run by church organizations and things like that, and the information they offer is to talk people out of having an abortion. And
And
you
they
know what?
lie.
They lie. That's the problem. I don't fundamentally disagree with the messaging they have, because if they're going to suggest adoption or some other thing, fine. If you convince somebody and they're okay with that, adoption these days can actually be a very positive experience. You can help a family out that can't have a kid. They're going to cover your expenses during that time. You could really give somebody a gift, but that's still your choice.
Right. Well, and some of the things that we're reading about these clinics is that they pretended that they had the ability to provide services like abortions to people that called. And then when the person got there, they would attempt to convince them not to have an abortion. And they would also lie to them about how long they had to make the decision. So if the person left and then realized that's what they wanted to do, it was some of them reported having gone past the time that option was available to
Yeah.
them.
It's very horrible and manipulative. And again, that's where it's this double-edged sword, because some of the suggestions they might have are not awful. The delivery method and the organizations doing it are very awful.
Well, and I know, I don't know the way things work here in Colorado. When I was in Washington, I had some experiences with some different clinics, and they had some very particular rules, some of which I know from working with activists in Colorado are burdensome. For example, most clinics in Washington won't allow you to get an abortion on the day that you come in. They make you wait. So if you go in for an appointment, you have to wait at least a day. And the reason the activists that I spoke with here said that's kind of burdensome is that for people who are in rural areas who have to drive 3 or 4 hours to get an appointment, then they have to do that twice, and maybe they have to take 2 days off work or something like that. Um, there's some questionable logic around it. However, in listening to the experiences of people, the folks who are anti-abortion are like, "Oh, clinics, all they want to the clinics actually don't ever want anyone to do it." They will counsel people at every step of the way that, you don't have to do this. You can stop at any time. There are other options. We only charge you for how much work we've done. Like, they're very thoughtful about it because there's no clinic actually that is like, I really want to do this in some kind of, they want women to have the option. They want children to be wanted.
Yeah.
But they don't actually necessarily think like, wow, the abortions are the coolest thing ever.
No, exactly. And nobody does. And that was the point I was getting at, is that, I mean, I think I think it is okay to have some conversations around alternatives.
I think it's important to have them. I mean, I would love to see a national dialogue. I would love to see sex and health ed classes that didn't just talk about abstinence, but also talked about fostering, adoption, and, teen mothers get a bad rap. And there's some really great articles on, a lot of the issues with teen mothers is actually the stigma that teens face and the lack of social support that they get. There's no reason that like a teen mother can't be successful. I'm not saying that they should have children, just that there are lots of options and there are a lot of different things that would work if we created more systems. Like if we had systems that if, a woman had a child at 17 and had support through college so that she could get self-sufficient, or if she wanted college, a trade school or whatever.
Well, we don't take care of people with kids in general. I
That's
mean,
true.
I have a coworker who's male, and his wife just had a baby, and he took some time off, and we have a great policy, and it's notable because that's not normal. So we're just not in line as a country with this idea of family values. And I don't think I've ever met anyone on the left who is opposed to the idea of family values. It just might not look like the, Midwestern white picket fence ideal that other people have. But in general, like, most people want to have a family, want to be able to take care of it, and want to choose and plan how it's going to come about.
Yeah. And I get the sort of um recognizing that you can't really plan anything, right? Like,
Yeah.
life is what happens when you're having other plans. And sometimes, biology happens. And it's not to say that there aren't going to be times when people are like, "Oh, this is what's happening for me right now. Like I'm having a baby." And it's not necessarily what I was thinking I was going to do. And I do think just even knowing that option exists, even if someone doesn't necessarily go into a clinic, they can have that moment of, am I genuinely going to commit myself to taking on this responsibility?
Yeah.
And I agree. I really think it'd be my partner is adopted. I had some really good friends growing up who are adopted. Like, but I don't feel like that's something that we talk about as an important option.
Yeah. And again, that's not to say that I would ever discourage somebody who's just like, you know what, this is not a right time for me. I can't do this. I can't even go through the pregnancy. Um, I need to have an abortion. Again, it's not my decision to make. That's the point of pro-choice. It's pro-choice for whoever's in that situation. Um, but yeah, and that's where the Bicurian and polarization aspect of this come in, because we've made it into this black and white. Either you want to kill babies or you want to protect them. And it's so much more complicated. And this is where a real national discourse and dialogue that's not down to a checkbox on your favorite candidate's website, pro choice, pro life, like, can we really actually talk about what day to day life is like? Politics should not override daily life.
So here's my question for you. What what do you think about the role of men in this decision? Because I know that that's something that a lot of men have really expressed, this feeling of frustration that if they're with a woman who gets pregnant, that if she wants to keep the child, they're on the hook. And if she doesn't, then they don't have a say in stopping.
Yeah. I do find that to be an interesting one. Um, I can't even necessarily say that I feel strongly one way or the other about it. I think having a child is such a endeavor for a woman, and a man opting in or out. I mean, let's face it, culturally, that's kind of a problem right now because men can always opt in or out. Women tend to be on the hook for it, the pregnancy, the rearing, all of that stuff. I mean, I hate to make biological arguments, but a woman can feed that child once it's born. It's the capability from her own body to do so. And I do think that a woman's right to choose does override certain aspects of the male side of the argument because of that. That said, I think that this is an area where men need to actually have some responsibility themselves, right? They need to understand that if you're willing to have sex with somebody, you are potentially opting into being a father. And if you want to be a father and you're with somebody and you're unsure of it and they end up pregnant and they end up saying, this is not something I want right now, that likewise is kind of on you about the communication phase of your relationship.
Well, and what I'm thinking of as you're saying that is also I think that it's important for men that don't think they want to have children specifically to make sure they're taking clear responsibility for any kind of contraception that's occurring. I don't know if you saw there was a male contraceptive pill that came out, and it's from what I understand, it's back in trials or whatever because the men who were testing it were like, oh, there's too many side effects, and they're like the same or fewer side effects than the female pill.
Yeah. And it's another area where we've made it a woman's responsibility, really. So,
So I think that's maybe where I sit is that as long as it's a woman's responsibility to deal with contraception, then it's probably her choice. I think if we create a scenario where men are taking on that responsibility, then it seems because that's not fair. They can have all the choice, but none of the responsibility.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's a whole potential topic for another show because that is coming into a whole idea of men's rights and where those kinds of lines are. And
Can you hear my eyes roll?
And I'm not even saying that in like the negative, like men should have rights way. I'm talking about it from like, because to me, in that case, that's a men's rights as a responsibility thing. Like you have responsibilities and you have rights. And that's one of those areas that's gray because it's both.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, I made that joke, and I've read a friend of mine recommended a men's rights book to me, and I read it, and there were some points in it that I thought were interesting. So it's something we could certainly delve into at some point. And I don't know, it's also there's a lot of stuff I don't know that I should say out loud on a recording. It's really what it gets down to.
So join us in a few weeks for a show where Aisla will say some things out loud that she shouldn't on a recording.
Oh my gosh, don't be so bad.
So to wrap the show in this one, I think the real point here is to make sure our listeners are aware of that this is what's going on. It's probably going to be a very, very kind of grassroots battle. And to be honest, there's nothing that can really be done. You can vote people in that might agree with your stance on things, but realistically, be prepared for a major shift in this country. There's going to be states with legal abortion and states without it probably very soon.
Well, if it doesn't go to court before the next election, the presidential election, and if we actually vote in, I have to say Democrat, it's not really what I think, but, if we vote in a different party, different political focus, and we turn 4 seats in the Senate, we can impeach Judge Kavanaugh. That's a lot of ifs, but I'm just letting you know.
Well, there you go. You can go. I'm sure somebody in Vegas will take a bet on that one.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Welcome to the Bicarian Moment.
I'll go first.
All right.
Hi, everyone. My Bicarian moment is cultured chicken or meat, which people often call lab-grown meat. It's when they take cells and they grow like a chicken breast.
Yep. This is making the news.
Yes, and there was an article about it. Oh, they also call it cell-based meat or clean meat. And the company that's doing it right now is called Finless Foods. There's a few, but this is one of them. And I am definitely torn on this because on the one hand, I'm like, this is great. The person who tasted it said they literally could not tell the difference between it and any other chicken they'd ever had.
Yeah.
So that's cool. You don't have to kill anything.
This is the interesting part to me, is that this really shuts down the argument about meat being murder. because this is meat that is literally just a collection of cells. A carrot is just a collection of cells.
But I've read so much sci-fi, and so I'm very concerned that this is going to be, I don't know, the next blob or something. It's really interesting.
It feels in that realm of genetically modified because it's pretty hardcore genetically modified.
Right. And I get that, the whole frankenfood thing is just a bizarre sort of primitive reaction. And yet I still have it, I'll be honest. And so I live in this really interesting tension of, I think it's great. We're not going to have to kill animals. We can have meat. Meat's delicious. And I don't know if I'd want to eat it.
I do have the same feeling. I feel a little weird about it, but I do think that even from an environmental impact and from
Well, that's one of the questions is that when I was reading the article, they still haven't really determined whether the environmental impact would actually be reduced, because right now it's new technology, so it requires an awful lot of resource input in order to create. They haven't gotten to anything like
to commercialize it,
to
sure.
commercialize it. It's like solar, right? Like solar's super awesome, and the investment in energy to create solar panels for a lot of the panels doesn't pay off before the panels are, especially the older ones, before the panels are likely to be out of service.
Yeah.
So it's a feel-good moment. Yay, I'm getting energy from the sun. Except creating the panels was not energy from the sun.
Yeah.
At least
No,
not yet.
I do feel like this one's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on, and it's definitely going to be a polarizing thing. Whether people who like meat feel good about it being grown, and whether people who don't like meat would feel okay eating something that, you know, crosses off a couple of those concerns that vegetarians might have.
Yeah. So at any rate, that's my bi-carry moment. I think it's cool and weird, and I hope it works, and I'm not sure I want it.
Yeah. Mine is going to sound a little bit weird because it involves something going on in a very female focused realm right now, and that is goop. But I admit I have been fascinated by the stories I have been reading online about it. And primarily from the stance of basically arguments against Goop. And for anybody who doesn't know, Goop is a organization started by Gwyneth Paltrow and then several other big name Hollywood people, geared towards women's health. And the real issue has come up about whether or not the health things they recommend are pseudoscience or even dangerous in some cases. And so you've got male and female doctors arguing in both directions around whether or not you should take a jade egg and shove it directly into your genitals for your health benefits. What I find fascinating about it is that it's one of the first times I've seen something that has this sort of almost like club movement, right? I mean, for years we've seen people, that want to belong to something do things like join and support the NRA because it's in line with their values, but mostly they feel like they belong, and it's an Elks Club or any of that sort of thing. And so I'm torn because I think it's fantastic that women have an opportunity to be a part of something like that and have that sense of belonging to a sisterhood of some way, the way that the men's clubs have existed for millennia. But the other side of it is it actually dangerous? And that could be a real concern.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me that I was just listening, as you know, my favorite other podcast, besides from ours, is The Hidden Brain. And they did an article or an episode on placebo effect. And it's a very genuine occurrence. And so, there's an interesting conundrum even in the medical community around the reality that there are a lot of procedures, even surgical procedures, that can work because of placebo. And so when something like Goop is happening, where is the ethical stand on it? If people are actually feeling a sense of benefit, if it is placebo, does it matter when our own medical community gives benefit through placebo?
Yeah. And again, I'm not actually passing any kind of judgment on Goop. I just find I almost find it concerning that there's a large group of women so strongly desiring to feel like they're a part of some sort of a thing, a movement, a health movement, something where they can feel free to express themselves and all of that. And it could be based on dangerous pseudoscience. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that to anyone. And in this case,
I think I need a jade egg.
you can let me know how that works out.
Not on the show, though. Sorry, guys. This is going to be personal. I have a right to privacy.
Yes, you do. Anyway, just something that really caught my attention, and it's weird to see, interesting areas of polarization in pop society right now, and culturally coming up like that. So, something I'm keeping an eye on.
I like that. Thanks for listening. Join our mailing list at bit.ly/bicure, BICUR, and get episodes and blogs conveniently emailed directly to you. Learn more about us at bicurian.com/podcast.
And if you like what we're doing, please rate us on your favorite listening platform.
Thanks for listening.